Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and we are delighted to have you with us as always here at the studio, and also want to welcome the listeners at 92.1 WFOV, and we're very glad to have you with us as well. We are airing that program at 12 o'clock on Saturdays, and Paul Herring does a very good job at the station. And we want to have you to tune in all the programs there at allpointstv.com here. And then at the studio, 92.1, want you to tune in to the programs that they have on that station as well.
You got a good time slot, 12 o'clock Saturdays. That's a very good time slot.
Yeah, and I think we're picking up a few listeners over there, too. As some of them were asking for the time, because I mentioned it on another network. And we're very glad to have anybody that wants to tune in and want you to participate in what we're doing here. This is allpointstv.com, and we'll be on 92.1 on Saturday at 12. And pay attention to everything that we're doing at these two networks. We have some very good programs at both stations, and we know that you are enjoying the music as well on 92.1. We don't do any music here, do we, John, unless we bring somebody here as a guest?
Yeah, we just we do music. The reason why is because the copyright infringement, some consideration, and ASCAP. If we did play music and stuff and it was recorded, it'd be up there, and we'd have to pay ASCAP, which is the musicians basically all have that, so they part out the money and give it to the people whose music it is being used. So it's a few $100s, a few $1,000 a year for that. So we really can't afford that. I'd like to go down that road myself someday, but right now we can't do it. So if you guys are by the way, if you guys are wanting to do a song, or if you want to play your music and stuff like that, and you want to get some kind of an audience, and it's already not copywritten, or you can give us permission to use it, please let us know and send it in, okay?
Like the song that we have as our introduction here, and that is a song that we had sent to the studio, and we use it every time we open the program up. Okay, again, we're very glad to have you, and I want you to stay tuned for the next hour. We'll be taking our break with 92.1 at the 26-minute mark, and we will have them come back after 4 minutes of their break, and we will go ahead with the program beyond that point. We're glad to have you because we know you could be doing a lot of things with your time, and you don't have to be tuning in our programs here at the studio. So we feel very blessed when we can have you come along with us and to participate in what we're doing here. I want to come to the studio today to talk about an article that I read last night. It's an article titled John Kelly. John Kelly is the White House Chief of Staff, and the article is John Kelly spread an ahistorical view of the Civil War on Fox, and Ta-Nehisi Coates responded. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, and I want to talk about that article because when I read the article, I just could not, it bothered me to read this article because it showed me once again how irrational this society has become. America is a very irrational society, and I don't know if that's is that based upon the lack of information, or we're not, the thinking level in this society right now is probably at the lowest ebb it's ever been. And when I read the headline, John Kelly spread an ahistorical view of the Civil War on Fox, meaning he was on the Fox network, and he spread an ahistorical view of the Civil War on that network. And then they act as if when Ta-Nehisi Coates responded, that his response was appropriate because of the ahistorical view of the Civil War spread by John Kelly. When I read the article, it did not compute, because John Kelly's view of the Civil War was more accurate than those that were critiquing his critiquing his perspective. And that's why I want to come to the studio, at least for the first part of the program, to talk about, because we still don't get it. You know, I said once before on one of our programs that we haven't had a civil war in this country, and I know that turned a lot of people's eyebrows were raised. A lot of persons, you know, just could not stomach the idea that there's been a misunderstanding, really a misappropriation of information about this war. They call it a civil war that was fought between 1861 and 1865. That is not a civil war. If the war that was fought in 1776 to 1783 is not a civil war, then how is it that the war fought in 1861 to 1865 is a civil war? If one is not a civil war, as the 13 states, and I would call them 13 nations, if that's not a civil war, then the 11 states, the Confederate States, doing the same thing that they did, if the mimicking of what they did in 1776 was not a civil war, then how is it that those that are mimicking the same thing, how is that a civil war when the other was not a civil war? And that's not the only question I want to raise here. But there's a lot of irrational comments that are being made. Now they claim in this heading that they were going to correct the ahistorical view of John Kelly. So I'm going to read some parts of the article, and we're going to go through a little of it just to see if that is not more ahistorical than what John Kelly was talking about. The article started out saying, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly went on Fox, and then they got in parentheses, and then inside the parentheses they got quotation marks. So you're going to say went on Fox, and they got news in quotation marks, as if Fox News is not news, but I take it MSNBC is, and NBC and CNN, those are news stations, but Fox is not. And yet we've been calling all of them fake news. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly went on Fox, quote unquote news, and announced his support for Confederate monuments. Now you could look until the cows came home, and you would never see in there where John Kelly went on Fox and announced his support for Confederate monuments. Well, that's not what John Lewis is. That's not what John Kelly is saying. John Kelly is saying that we should not be pulling these monuments down because we should not be judging the past based upon present standards. And I know everybody wants to go back and say slavery was wrong. Of course it's wrong. But it's wrong based upon today's standards. It wasn't wrong back in the day in which it was practiced. And I don't mean just in this country here. I mean when it's practiced all over the world.
I'm going to ask you a question right here. Okay, what do you think actually? I mean, there's some, for the longest time, slavery was not a issue. I mean, there's nobody. It's just basically status quo. What do you think prompted or promoted the idea of maybe examining that and seeing it as such a reprehensible, as a reprehensible institution? I see it as actually a continuity of Christianity. Yeah, Christians, and ironically, and I'll be the first one to admit that slavery was never denounced in the Bible, in the New Testament or the Old Testament. It was just a standard. It was already the existing culture that all these cultures are developing around. I mean, the mindset, I should say, that these cultures embraced or just allowed to permeate them. But I think it was the advent of Christianity, because now you started seeing people as as your brothers or sisters or your equals or whatever. And I mean, and actually that dovetails well with the Stoics, the philosophers from Greece and Rome. They actually, so one of their tenets was that there was everybody was on the same page basically for them. They were basically saying that the slave and the emperor, although they had different positions in life, they were equal in the fact that their faculties, the faculties in their mind were actually capable of understanding one another. So basically, that's where there's this commonality, there's equality. So I mean, and the Christianity seemed to resonate well with that, what we consider pagan, philosophy that existed before. But what do you think actually caused the value of the individual?
I don't think that we could say that it comes from anything related to the biblical mandate. In Ephesians 6:5, it says, slaves, obey your masters. Where slavery becoming more of a looked at as a banditry type of institution comes out of the period of enlightenment. In the 18th century, those philosophers that we had in Europe, and they are philosophically beginning to challenge the notion that there's universal practice, and I'll read something about the universality of the practice from a book I brought to the studio, but the universality of the practice. Slavery, there is no place where slavery is not practiced on any of the continents which are habitated by any one on the planet. That includes the Americas as well, where the Native Americans were practicing slavery. It certainly was practiced in Africa, and if it had not been practiced in Africa, there would have been no slave trade.
And that surprises people too. The very word slave is actually a change of the word Slav, which was the people reference to. They made it the people what we consider Russia or Central Eastern Europe. They call these people Slavics. Well, the Slavic people don't call themselves Slavs. They call themselves Rus. Okay, and then Russia is the mother of all Rus, of Rus. So people don't understand where that comes from. But the word slave comes from Slav, and Slav, they were Eastern Europeans,
Yeah, and I take that. I do understand that premise, and that is definitely a true statement. But I take that even that statement as a caveat of being more exact about the history of slavery. Sure, the word slavery comes from the word Slav, but that is not an inclusive understanding of the universality of it, because and I brought this book to show another point here, and that is that it takes away from the fact that whites were slaves in terms of being the victims of slave masters that were not white. See, Slav would be the idea of slaves in Europe. You can call them serfs if you want to. But the idea of there being slaves in Europe, so Europeans enslaving Europeans. I get that, but that does not talk about the issue in a very comprehensive manner, because the book is written and edited by Paul Baffler. It's called White Slaves, African Masters, an anthology of American Barbary captivity narratives. In other words, there were white slaves in the Barbary Coast, and the masters of those slaves were, and I'll read it again, white slaves, African masters. And when they say African here, in this context, they're not just talking about blacks. When they say Africa, they're not just saying black people. They're saying those that are in the continent of Africa, and some of them are black, some of them are Arab, some of them are Berbers, but they're saying African masters. And so the whole context of slavery is that it's a universal practice, and it's practiced on all the continents by all the people, and that there are none that are innocent of the practice. Now, the only reason why it is pigeonholed as it is in terms of it being some Western construct is because out of the cultural references of the West, the only ones that have developed the cultural references that bring about guilt for the practice is in Western societies. There's no guilt in other societies because it's not been condemned in other societies. They just stop practicing it. And it was the West that imposed its will upon the rest of the world that brought an ending to it in other parts of the world. Although slavery has never left the world, it's still in the world right now. But there's no place in it that's acceptable in the Western society. But you go into certain parts of Africa and Asia right now and find slavery.
Matter of fact, I have a friend from Thailand, and her mom's family, she admitted to it, her family had slaves. I mean, and see, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in Thailand they have a big influx of Chinese nationals, and they've been in there for so long. They're considered part of the fabric of Thailand. But their ethnicity is definitely different than the Thai. But they had practiced a form of slavery in Thailand as well, which further back backs what you're saying. Was a universalized practice.
It's universal, and I'll read something from Thomas Sowell, who I think is one of the great minds of our time, although a lot of persons don't like Sowell, because Sowell is an out-of-the-box thinker. He is a non-orthodox, non-predictable, thinker. He's a free thinker. And you can't pigeonhole him into saying something because it's politically correct. Sowell talks from the documentation, and there are not very many persons that will do that. He has a chapter in one of his books called The Real History of Slavery. The Real History of Slavery. And in the chapter, which is chapter 4, it starts on page 111 of the book called, and you're not going to like the title of this book, but we can certainly see that this book has resonance as well, because you have rednecks. And we always talk about the rednecks, think of the South. Here's a title of Sowell's book is Black Rednecks. And that flies in the face of a lot of understandings, because the idea is that blacks can't be racist. Only whites can be racist. Arabs can't be racist. Native Americans can't be racist. Chinese can't be racist. There is no human quality that any group has a monopoly on, and you can get off that right now, about there are certain groups that cannot exhibit racism because they don't have power and all that other nonsense that we are out here exporting. As I said, we are a very irrational society right now. Sowell's book is called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that is both of these groups, in terms of racial dialogue in this country, we can't have a sane dialogue with those two groups at the table. Black rednecks and white liberals. I listen to black rednecks all the time, and I also listen to white liberals all the time, and both of them are creating a dialogue that's problematical. You may not like me saying that, but when I read this article by called John Kelly Spread an Ahistorical View of the Civil War on Fox, and Ta-Nehisi Coates responded, I knew then the article was written by a liberal, and nothing in this article is true. And I'm going to go through the article to point those things out. But as I said at the beginning of this program, we have become a very irrational society. And no one wants to speak from the documentation in this country anymore. It's all this he said, she said, and repeating things. People are parrots in this country. Nobody wants to go to the documentation.
What, to further your point, though, about, we're irrational. We're basically thinking on feelings. If you look at what's current in you watch the Star Wars episodes, the movie, it seems like search your feelings, Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, let's face it, our system of governance and stuff like that, and our system of challenging things is based upon law, which is basically looking at facts, not feelings. And everybody becomes now as an activist. Even and left and right both are of this, guilty of this.
Yeah, I feel that is wrong. Well, what do you know? Your feelings are not facts. I'm not really interested in people's feelings. I am interested, as an educator, I'm interested in what do you know. I've had people write on my Facebook wall, and they'll write, I disagree, and put a period there, and that's the end of it. As if their disagreement is an argument. In other words, the argument that I'm putting forth is wrong and is invalidated because there are those persons that disagree with the position without putting a counter argument in its place. Not only is that a problem, it's a problem that they don't see it as being a problem. They don't even see a need to put an argument next to the argument that I'm presenting. They think that it's invalidated because they don't agree with it. I feel it's wrong. Yeah, but what does the documentation say? And so when I read this article and I was thinking about some of these documents that I have in my library, and I have a very extensive library, so when I come out to talk about these issues, I don't come out here trying to win anybody's favor. If the documentation says other than what is a popular view, I'm going against a popular view. It's as simple as that. And so this article created a tremendous problem for me. I read this article and I said, what are they talking about? None of the things in this article is true. Let me read a couple of sentences from Thomas Sowell's book. And the chapter I'm reading from is chapter 4. It's called The Real History of Slavery. And here's what the great Thomas Sowell, one of our premier thinkers, no matter what they say about him, he's a premier thinker. He says, slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine, and as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is naturally, I should say, different from the way it is usually portrayed in history books. Mention slavery, and immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants. In the southern United States, or at most, Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. Sowell goes on and makes this statement, which is very profound. No other historic horror is so narrowly construed. In other words, in all other historical events of epidemic proportions, as was slavery now, has ever been pigeonholed as being a single event taking place in a single place, referencing a single group as the perpetrators of the event and those that are the victims of it. We've never had an epidemic in history that's been of universal proportions to be so narrowly defined and constrained. He says, mention slavery, and you know this and I knew it as well, that immediately what comes to mind is slavery was black people being enslaved by white people. Sowell says no other historical event is so narrowly construed or so narrowly described. He says no one thinks of war. War is universal. No one thinks of war. Famine is universal. People are hungry in different parts of the world. People are hungry here. It's universal. Or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. We don't think about war, famine, decimating disease as local events. These are universal events. He says these are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet, and so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country during 3 centuries, its tragedies would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. He's saying that to quantify slavery as being a single event with a single group of people who are the enslaved and a single group that is the enslaver, if you restrict it down to that narrow description of what slavery was in history, you're only dealing with 1/10 of the horrors of slavery. That means that 9/10 of slavery then is outside the context of how we normally see slavery. 9/10 of it is outside of that prescription of slavery that we have as we view it through this narrow lens. We're going to take a break right now. We'll come back in 4 minutes with 92.1, and we'll take a break for 4 minutes on that station. And when they come back, we'll pick it up at that point for them, but we're going to continue on allpointstv.com. Glad to have you with us. Stay tuned for the next 25 minutes or so as we wrap this up. We're glad to have all our viewers here, and also all of those who listen to us on the radio station. Glad to have you with us as well. And we're just trying to get through some of the maze here so that we can create more clarity in this society, because we're losing it. This society is becoming more and more irrational every day.
I'd like to know this. How come the people who actually went through slavery, and they would, if there was a person, a group of people that needed or should have this rage, it should have been the people right after the so-called Civil War ended, whatever, but no, they just basically, they wanted to resume life. They wanted to basically, they didn't get the 40 acres and a mule, admittedly, whatever was promised, but they moved on. As a matter of fact, now it's like, it's kind of like throwing the black community, in my opinion, if you look at the statistics and the numbers, backwards to now dependence on creating another form of slavery.
Yes.
They're dependent upon the state, whereas before the 1960s and 1970s, 70% of black-owned businesses, blacks had businesses, 67% of those people. That was in the black communities. They're owned by blacks themselves. The businesses were owned. So now it's going back to where actually they're now back on the plantation and they're happy with this. I don't understand that.
There's a conceptual incarceration. They call it, some refer to it as mental slavery, but it's a conceptual misunderstanding, and that can be just as powerful of an enslavement mechanism as the physical slavery. That can be mental slavery also. And this misunderstanding we have, where people have adopted a victim mentality, that can enslave a people, because it overwhelms them with the idea that that is that's their inheritance, and they can't get out of it because it's been predestined and preordained, as if slavery can be passed down through the bloodstream. I mean, who hasn't been a slave? Who on the planet have ancestors that were not at some point enslaved? There's no group, certainly not the Jews. That's described very, very much so in terms of their 430-year sojourn in Egypt, so they certainly can claim that. So slavery happened to the Jews. Are the Jews, in fact, still walking around wars mean we can't do anything because of slavery? No. They put that in back of them, and they use it really as a catalyst to unite the Jews. They don't use it to overwhelm them with victimization. What they do is they use things like the slavery in Egypt, for example, and also the Holocaust as a way of bringing unity among Jews. Why? How do they do it? By pointing to the pain outside of the Jewish group, so that if you understand the pain on the outside of your group, you don't want to bring pain into the group, because you recognize the pain that's visited upon you by outsiders. You don't need to bring the pain inside your group then, if there are people that are willing to bring the pain upon you from outside your group. That creates the unity. They teach the Holocaust as a way of creating unity, not to create victimization. And the enslavement period of other groups, they've all had it. And now we want to welcome the group coming back from 92.1 WFOV. We want to thank you for coming back. We are about where we were when you left about 4 minutes ago, and we are very glad that you stayed there waiting to come back to the program. We appreciate all the listeners and those who are able to view us on allpointstv.com. We're glad to have you with us as well. I want to commend again Paul Herring for the fine job he's doing over there at the other studio. They're doing a great job of their programming, and I listen to everything they have there practically, because I've kind of stopped watching television. And I get a lot of information right now from the alternative media. And allpointstv.com is alternative media. And also I consider 92.1 to be alternative media as well. Some very good programs on that network. We're continuing with Sowell's statement here about the universality of slavery, where there's no group that's been able to escape its tentacles. And then after he talks about the universality of slavery, he then raises a question. He says, why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? In other words, if slavery is universal, then why is it looked at and described as being so provincial, as if it's a single event, single groups involved, as if it's that group only and no other groups? When he said earlier that if you just talk about that aspect of slavery, the one we focus on, he says that's only 1/10 of the slavery that has occurred in the world. So he asks this question then, why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Why would you describe something that's so extensively practiced in the world? History is full of slavery. All groups are part of it. Why then would there be such a provincial outlook on it when it was a universal practice worldwide, everywhere on all the continents? Often, he says, it is those who are most critical of a Eurocentric view of the world, you know, the Afrocentrics. They are critical of the Eurocentric view, that is, say everything is European and so on and so forth. And what Sowell is saying is a very important point he's making here, is that those that claim to be against the Eurocentric view, to say slavery is a provincial practice when it's universal, that's a Eurocentric view. Only Europeans did it. That's Eurocentrism. And they want to act like that's an Afrocentric view. It's Eurocentric. And what Sowell says is, why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often it is those who are most critical of a, quote, Eurocentric view of the world who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years, unless it was not this evil itself that was a real concern? Listen carefully to this part here. But rather the present day uses of that historic evil. In other words, why would something that is practiced worldwide, no group escape its practice, no group escape being affected by it, by having some of its descendants, having some of his ancestors rather, enslaved by it? Why then would there be such a provincial narrative of slavery if it was so universal? What would explain that? And Sowell gives a very brilliant explanation. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years, unless it was not that this evil itself that was a real concern, but rather the present day uses of that historic evil? Do you see any signs of that going on anywhere? If people are using their pain, this is almost like blasphemous to me, using their pain not to bring their own group together, as the Jews have done, for example, but to use their pain in order to extract benefits from those who never were the progenitors of slavery and never practiced it. That's why. You don't raise slavery to the Arabs, for example. And there's a reason why that is true. You don't raise slavery to the Arabs, although the Arabs went into Africa in 639. You know, Islam is only 17 years old at that point, because Islam I would date, well, okay, you could date Islam at 610 AD, since that's the year of the prophet's first revelation. So let's say then it starts in 610. I would date it at 622, quite frankly, because I think that's when it really would gotten off the ground by the flight, the Hajra, the flight, which took place in 622. But if you want to date it at 16, okay, I'll give you that as well. So then 29 years after the first revelation, Islam is now going in to Africa, starting over in Egypt and going across the Maghreb, meaning Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, going into eventually ending up in Morocco and Mauritania. That enslavement would have started in the 7th century of the Common Era, or I would say it through the Christian dating. It started in 639 AD, and so in the 7th century AD, Anno Domini, you have the Arabs coming into Africa as enslavers, and their mission is to bring about the Islamization of those places where they conquered. But they found out when they got there that if they in fact Islamized Africa, they could not enslave Africa. And so they backed off of some of the Islamization because it would be a contradiction to enslave those who are also Muslims. They backed off of it. And somebody ought to go read the book written by George Ayete, who is a historian from Ghana. And his book, I'll give you the page number. It's not on that page. Then come in. I'll pay you if it's not on this page, but you're not gonna get in the pay. Go read George Ayete's book. Where George Ayete says on page 105 of his book that the slave trade that went on in Africa, that is, say, the Arab slave trade, that predates the European slave trade by 700 years, he's going to say that there were more Africans, and I say Africans now, I'm not just talking about black folks, I'm saying all those in the continent of Africa. There were more blacks killed in the Arab slave trade than in the European slave trade. In fact, to call this the European slave trade is incorrect. It's the African slave trade. It's not the European slave trade. You can go read Bassett Davidson's book called The African Slave Trade. He had named the book before he called it The African Slave Trade. He called it African Mother. African Mother. Then he changed the title of the book, didn't change in the content of the book. He changed the title of the book from African Mother to The African Slave Trade. And what Bassett Davidson, the late Bassett Davidson, is making reference to is that if there had not been a cooperation in the slave trade of those in Africa, then the slave trade as we knew it would not have existed. And I have been there, and I know when I went there, and I've been in those slave castles in Africa. And when I went to Ghana, to the oldest slave castle, slave fort if you want to call it that, which is Castle Elmina, the Castle of the Mine, M-I-N-A, Elmina, E-L-M-I-N-A, Elmina, the Mine. Its language comes out of the Iberian Peninsula in the southern part of Europe, where you have Spain and Portugal. So L-E-L-L-V, the word T-H-E, Mina, M-I-N-A, so it's saying the Mine. So the first slave fort in Africa, Elmina, was the fort in Ghana, Ghana was called the Gold Coast at that time. You see why it's called the Mine now. But later on in '57, they'll give the name. They'll have the name Ghana when it gains its independence and become independent. They're going to name it Ghana after the Ghanaian Empire. And if you go to that castle, Amina, which is set up in 1482, that's 10 years before Cristobal Colon. You call him Christopher Columbus. This is 10 years before Cristobal Colon, Italian, but you have anglicized his name with Christopher Columbus, would have come to the Western Hemisphere in 1492, 10 years later. So when Elmina is set up 10 years earlier, those slaves there sold to the Portuguese, because the Portuguese are the ones building they're building this castle, this fort. They're building it, but they're building it with the permission of the king. They're not going in there kicking these doors down, and they're not doing it for what Bassett Davidson writes on page 26 and 27 of his book called The African Slave Trade. He says on those 2 pages there, he says that there are many people who say that it was a tsetse fly. It was a lack of having something to deal with malaria that would have kept Europe out of the interior of Africa. But Bassett Davidson puts that notion to rest on page 26 and 27 of his book, when he talks about that what kept Europeans out of the interior of Africa all during the slave trade. They did not go into the interior of Africa until the 19th century, when the slave trade was over. Starting around 1884 is when they were meeting at the Berlin Conference, and then that began to happen. But during the slave trade, which is 1441, to, if you want to date it to the time period which is cut out when it's cut out in the United States, it would have been cut out here based upon the Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, where they said that the slave trade could go on for another 20 years, and then after a 20-year period of time, where nobody could bother during that 20-year period of time, they could, if it behooved them to do so, to pass a law that would end the slave trade in that particular year, meaning that it could only be ended in 1808. And the country, to its credit, to this country's credit, the very year when it could pass a law against the slave trade, it did so, but could not do so for 20 years, from 1787 to 1807. Could not pass a law, but in 1808 they could do so, and in that year they did so. Passed a law to prohibit the slave trade. Now, when they prohibited the slave trade, there were people in Africa, kings and that, who were benefiting from the slave trade, that were angrified, if you want to use that word, that were upset about the slave trade being ended. Why? Because the trade was benefiting the elite in Africa. This is how Europe going into Africa and kicking the doors in and snatching people, like Alice Haley said in that bogus claim that he made in Roots. Roots is nothing but fiction. That film is not accurate. This is not the slave trade. Europe does not go into Africa and colonize Africa until the 19th century. And we're talking here about the 15th century. That's 4 centuries earlier. And Europe doesn't have the firepower to go into Africa and rule anything at this point, because the firepower of both constructs were about the same. And that's why Bassett Davidson was saying that it wasn't the tsetse fly, it wasn't malaria, it was not malaria that kept Europe out of Africa. He says it was the striking power of African armies. Isn't that what Tekamenen was saying of Ghana? That he could mobilize 100,000 soldiers? Isn't that really what, in terms of go read this book by, this book called empress is Empress Tatu. It's called Menelik II and Empress Tatu. And that book talks about Tatu, who was the one that turned the Italians around in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa in Ethiopia. And when the Italians tried to go into Ethiopia in 1896, they were met with the striking power of Ethiopia's army that was following down through the line of Menelik. And, you know, Queen of Sheba, you've heard of her. And this idea that this continent was, in fact, colonized, go read volume 4 of A General History of Africa and find out that Africa was the last continent that was colonized by Europe. The last continent. And that's what, that's what is being said in that poem, where it says, no matter what happens, we have got the Gatling gun and they have not. And that is the machine gun. And that was said by a European philosopher in 1890. Before they had the Gatling gun, they couldn't go up against those indigenous armies in Africa and kick anything in. They had to go in there for a trade. And this was why it's called the African slave trade, because the terms of that trade were set by Africans. But they didn't call themselves Africans at this time. Now, that's another point to be made, and that is that the idea that these are Africans, that is the idea that is in fact European concept as well. And that's out of the book written by Adam Missouri called The Africans, where he says in that book, and it's another important point, he says that it took colonialism to tell the Africans that they're Africans. And what he means by that is that before Europe looked at all blacks with the European gaze, they're all black folks, so it must be the same group. Until that happened, they did not see themselves as Africans or as a continental group. They saw themselves as ethnically based. Igbo, I'm an Igbo chief, for example. So as Igbo or Yoruba or Fanti. Go to, I was sitting next to Dr. Akosha Purby. And she is Ashanti. And you have these kinds of indigenous groups in Africa, and this idea that they are all Africans, that's a European imposition upon Africa, because they see themselves as independent nations inside of Africa, and therefore their identity is not continental. Their identity is ethnically based, as it is everywhere else. And I hear people talking about they enslaved their own people. Africans enslaved their own people. They didn't enslave their own people. The Ashanti did not enslave the Ashanti and sell the Ashanti to Europe. The Ashanti enslaved those they fought. And if they did not enslave them, they'd have to kill them or put them in jail and house them and feed them. That wasn't tenable. So those that they defeated, they put them in the slave trade, but not members of the same group. Africa is more diverse and more ethnically based than Europe is. Europe is ethnically based. We have the French there, we have the Germans there, we have the English there, the Spanish there, the Portuguese there, the Italians. And nobody says that Hitler, when he attacked Churchill, he attacked England. No one said that when he attacked England that he was attacking his own people. Was Hitler attacking his own people by attacking Churchill? When Churchill gave him that poem by that black poet named Claude McKay, and recited that poem and said it to Hitler in his face, coming behind Naval Chamberlain, and here's Churchill talking, and he is speaking to Hitler in his face. And he said to him what Claude McKay has said in the 1920s, this black poet, and during the Harlem Renaissance: "If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. So even the monsters that we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsman," Churchill repeating this poet from the Caribbean, "O kinsman, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though lies before us but the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, fighting, but dying back. Fighting, but dying, but fighting back." That's Churchill. And it's also Claude McKay. And that is the Germans fighting the English, and the English returning the favor and fighting the Germans. Neither of them fighting their own people, because Germany had united behind Hitler, and Churchill had united the English. We'll die on the beaches. We'll fight on the beaches. We'll fight. We will never surrender. And this is two different ethnic populations fighting each other. Okay, that's a little bit of background, the history of it. But I want to come back to this article here before we get off the air, because this article is very problematical, and we have got to stop. Because we have got to stop being an irrational society in this country. This country is irrational. And you can have Ta-Nehisi Coates responding to John Kelly saying that the Civil War, they ran out of compromises. And they want to challenge him and say that he is saying that he is, and their words were, his support for Confederate monuments. We're not supporting Confederate monuments. We're saying that those monuments are being torn down because people don't understand the history of this battle. This is not a war to maintain slavery. They can tell you they can tell this to the layman. I'm a historian, and there's not one historian in this country, and that includes Philip Foner, Philip the fake Foner, Philip the phony. You know, they're not going to tell me that this war is over slavery. I have Lincoln's words in his first inaugural address, March the 4th, 1861. I have, this is Lincoln speaking. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so." Now, that's one thing, right? Okay, he can't legally do anything about it. Why? Because it's rooted in the Constitution. But this, the other part of it, here's the Lincoln part of it. "And I have no inclination to do so." So legally, he can't do it. Personally, he's not even inclined to do it.
It just goes show you another promise kept but not kept by a politician. And basically, that's all. I mean, if you just want to walk away from anything, it's just another politician's promise that wasn't, they didn't keep. That's it.
Lincoln did not see the military necessity of it. As a side point, what Lincoln will eventually come to is the position of his generals, because they were out there in the field fighting. They saw that the slaves were giving, allowing the Southerners to fight. Because if the slaves are doing the work, then the ones carrying the guns could carry the guns while the work was still being done. That increases the ability of the South to fight. So they wanted to liberate the slaves out in the field because they saw that as a military requirement. You can't win the war with slavery on those plantations, because it would in fact strengthen the military of the South. In other words, they saw the need militarily to to free the slaves. That's what they did out in the field. And what Lincoln was doing was placing them back on the plantation. Why? Because he had not yet come to the understanding that he has to issue this Emancipation Proclamation for the same reason as to why those generals out there were doing it. And Lincoln will come to that idea 2 years into the war. In 1863, he will in fact issue the Emancipation Proclamation, not to free the slaves, but to induce the slaves, to weaken the southern states, to issue this document not as an emancipatory document, but as a military document. And if it's an emancipatory document, why didn't it apply then to the northern states? Because there's slavery in the north as well as slavery in the south. That's another thing that is not well understood. There's slavery on both sides of this war. This is not a war for slavery. There are slaves in the Union states. So it can't be a war of slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation didn't touch the slaves in the Union states. But I don't fault Lincoln for that, by the way. I fault the historians for it. Lincoln had already said in his inaugural address that he had no legal authority to free the slaves in the states not in rebellion. But because those other states, 11 states, are fighting against the Union as a military requirement, he can, as commander-in-chief, use that power to free the slaves, although he had no authority to do so where they are, because who's listening to Lincoln if you're fighting them? Who's going to listen to Lincoln at that point? Nobody. And so this idea that these monuments come down because the South wanted to maintain slaves and the North wanted to get rid of slaves, this is nonsense. And we got to stop being irrational society and get the facts straight in this society. And we'll talk about this further because we're not through with it yet. We'll come back next week and we'll pick it up at this point. Until that time, we want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.